also addressed last week in the work session that went on. The Senate version of the sb3 was dated March 30th that this committee received. There have been there was a 7-hour public hearing on this bill. There have been numerous comments received, and most recently this committee received an amendment as a result of the work session. In front of you, the committee members, is that amendment with a side-by-side done by our legislative assistant, Pam Smarling, in regards to the work session copy that we had last week, which was a side-by-side. And currently before the committee, there is a discussion that was emailed with an amendment to Senate Bill 3201775. Is there a motion on the amendment to sb3? Representative Dean Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to move to adopt amendment 2017-1725.
Is there a second? It's been moved and seconded. Is there a discussion on the amendment at this time? Representative Dean Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this amendment basically came from what we talked about in the work session. There's probably the three biggest areas that we fixed or changed based on our discussion last week was to number one, we addressed the county issue that we talked about, I believe, Representative White brought up. There are some counties in New Hampshire where their county commissioners actually act as election officers for their own organization. So we addressed that.
For your information, the county officers was in the list that's repeated throughout the bill, and the committee amendment that was received with the side-by-side that appears on page 3.
One of the other issues that we addressed and discussed in the work session was removing the New Hampshire resident hunting and fishing license as one of the forms of verification. And then we had talked about the correct wording for New Hampshire drivers, non-drivers ID, so we verified that language as well. Those are probably the biggest changes in the amendment. Everyone has a side-by-side that was emailed out last night, and we're going to move about the amendment.
Representative, the third was the New Hampshire driver's license. Non-driver's ID, and if you look at that, that is all. That is, I just sort of it's on page 9, but it's also. But if you look at page 9, that language actually came from OLS, because apparently references to identification being officially entered by the state comes up on more than one occasion throughout the statutes, and that's the standard language that they use. Representative Pearson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I see the changes in this amendment. I've looked over them this morning. But it doesn't address the big problems that we had with this bill going into it and going into that work session we had last Tuesday. The chair characterized the bill thoroughly, but I'm going to stick with my characterization that this bill changes the means by which same-day voters register to vote, and in doing so it removes an affidavit from the option that they had to do such. This committee has yet to see any intent for why this bill is needed. We've heard these specious claims of voter fraud coming from our president, coming from our governor, from our secretary of state even, and totally unfounded. That is nowhere addressed in this bill. More than that, we have what this bill would essentially do is constructively disenfranchise citizens in the state by making poll lines longer. When Governor Sununu addressed this chamber when he first became inaugurated, he said his job at Waterville Valley was to make sure the lines were short and the hot dogs were warm. This bill does not make the lines short at New Hampshire polls. It does not make the lines longer. 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 It do this bill will make them longer. And all the testimony we heard when this bill had public hearings for hours, I think it was 7 hours of testimony, all of the testimony we heard, save the testimony from the bill's prime sponsor and co-sponsor, was to the effect that this bill would make lines longer at the polls. I was eventually able to get our Secretary of State to agree that long lines at the polls are an impediment to voting. With those two assertions known, I don't see how we can see the suspected voter fraud that's been alleged at all the levels of our government. I don't see how we can see that as compelling justification to enact this legislation. More than that, we have an unfunded mandate in this bill, in that it puts the burden, which appropriately belongs on the Attorney General, onto the Secretary of State. We've seen this committee has taken up legislation that could put to rest these claims of voter fraud in the state. I'm referencing specifically SB 197, which would fund the Attorney General's office. Actually, more than that, yesterday we had the Finance Committee, I think it was give $100,000 to the Attorney General to fund election fraud, an election fraud office or division, to investigate the 400-something unreturned voter affidavits that this really comes from. If we want to address that issue, we should be putting the money with the Attorney General. We should not be giving essentially the prelude to a criminal investigation. We should not be giving those investigatory powers to the Secretary of State. In asking our local supervisors of the checklist to do this would be extra work on what is an already very demanding job. And again, I'll reference the testimony we saw during the public hearing. None of the supervisors of the checklist want this. They don't want to be going to make house calls. And while this amendment fixes some of the problems that the Municipal Association came to us with at the public hearing, this amendment fails with the rest of the problems that this public hearing illuminated. And for that reason, I'll be voting against this amendment and really any form of the bill that this committee has seen up till now.
Thank you, Representative Pearson. Representative Harrington.
Yeah, I'd just like to address the idea of pushing the work down the town clerk, because that was a major concern I had with the bill, and that's been changed now. The town supervisors and inspectors are given options on the bill. They can decide if they want to check back records and other documentation and try to verify that the person claiming is domiciled where it actually is. They can go out and visit themselves or cause someone else to visit them if they don't have to. Or they can simply turn it over to the Secretary of State's office. So there is no mandate for them to do anything. If they feel uncomfortable doing this or they're overworked, they can simply just say, "You didn't receive the verification that they were supposed to give us by voter X, so I'm sending that information to the Secretary of State's office." That's all it takes for them to do. There is nothing being forced on them. Every one of those steps is optional, except for the one you refer to the Secretary of State's office. I think that's been made pretty clear. And also, there's been an awful lot of discussion on both sides of the aisle on this. There's a lot of misinformation. There is, and one of the big things I've heard over and over again from emails that this is going to disenfranchise college students, and there's absolutely nothing in this bill that does anything that you need to college students. It doesn't change the division. If you're a college student that qualifies as being domiciled in New Hampshire, it doesn't make any difference whether you're paying tuition, a resident or a non-resident, or where you used to live. You can still vote the same way. There's no change to that. So I think that's kind of a bit of misinformation that's been floating around. I've seen the letters from the editor and certainly hundreds of emails we've got. There's nothing to disenfranchise college students. We can just like everybody else.
Representative Porter.
If there's no mechanism in this bill for checking off sending somebody to the website, if it's just sending it to the Secretary of State, how is that different from what we're doing now with the letters that are going to the Secretary of State? I was going to hold off on comments, but I think I'll speak now. I still feel that there's a burden on voters to potentially have huge funds placed upon them or legally voting for not having the right piece of paper, and it gives me chills. If passing this bill prevents even one person from voting, or causes one person to get a $4,000 or $5,000 fine because they neglected to clean up a piece of paper, then I think that's a huge disservice to the voters of this state. I see no reason for this bill. It hasn't been explained to me why we need to do that. I don't understand why affidavits are signed for age, and there's two or three. Citizenship, those are still fine to verify by an affidavit. It's merely residency that needs to go through this. Filling out this form, as I mentioned in my first session, I took my husband to the utility meeting, the teacher physics, 7.5 minutes of work a day. Less able than the normal, and that was definitely by the online things. So for that reason, I feel support for the amendment, although the amendment is a few things, I certainly
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just in response to the earlier Representative's comments on the supervisor's having an option, and this will just echo what Representative Porter just said, that we will be left in the same exact situation where we have a face of Republicans next year claiming voter fraud that hasn't been amended because the supervisor's checklist is sitting on allegations of voter fraud. So I'm wondering when this committee is going to finally dispense with the rumors of voter fraud, trying to find the actual problem instead of legislating groups of people out of the rolls. The second point I'd make is that the one person turned away, or the one person who sees a prohibitively long line at the polls is just as criminal, if not more criminal, than the person who is suspected of fraudulently voting, because we have no evidence that this suspected fraudulent vote even exists. But we do have evidence that people who encounter long lines at the polls, or people who are required to bring in extra papers that they were unaware of, their votes do not count when they don't come back. And that to me is criminal.
Representative Jean Bailey.
I just want to clarify, I think at the end there you said that their votes don't count if they don't come back.
Yeah.
That's not, under Senate Bill 3, everyone's vote is counted.
Not if there's a long line at the poll and they leave.
Oh, okay.
He's talking about leaving and not coming back.
Right.
Further discussion on the amendment, Representative White.
Sure, I do recognize the discussion and the response to it, but I still have a really big problem eliminating an affidavit for one of the four purposes. Only one of the four purposes. And I think back to the public hearing, and not one city or town clerk came in and asked for this, or thought it was a good idea. Supervisors of the checklist, I think my memory is that not one supervisor of the checklist, that's not one in any of the 240-ish towns and cities in the state of New Hampshire came in supporting this. It puts a financial burden, if not in direct money, certainly in time and energy, on cities and towns, on the Secretary of State and Attorney General, without appropriating a nickel to do that. More important for me is the fact that we are going to require, at some point, agents of the state government, or should they choose, the city or county government, to do home visits. That is to knock on a door and say, papers, please. For the crime of not forwarding to them a utility bill or a rent receipt. And if they don't answer in the affirmative, they don't answer the door, they could face criminal penalties and immediate removal from the checklist. That is not the New Hampshire way, that is not the United States way, and it is completely inappropriate. And for that reason, I'll be opposing this bill.
Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have some concerns with some of the things that have been said in this meeting. First off, I understand what Representative Porter was saying about the fines, but those fines are no different than the fines that we already impose on people who do not live up to the standards to prove who they are and where they domicile. So there's nothing that's changed about those fines. It's also not true, Representative White, that we are expecting or putting unfunded mandates on cities, towns, and municipalities and making them do home visits. There's nowhere in the bill that say that. And I would like to address what Representative Pearson said about voter fraud. This bill was not designed to address voter fraud. What this bill was designed to do was to tighten up the wording around domicile and what exactly that means. And since it would be very difficult right now to get a constitutional amendment on board, and we don't have a clear-cut definition of domicile, this is what this bill is addressing. Students will not be disenfranchised. No one will be turned away at the polls, as we have always done. That's the New Hampshire way. As far as I'm concerned, we have nothing to hide. This is not a Republican versus Democrat issue, and I think if we dispense with the rhetoric around this, we may get some work done on this committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just think it's important for us to note that the original or durational residency requirements were originally introduced in the wake of the Civil War as a kind of a way to prevent all the mass migration and moving north of largely former slaves and African Americans. And there was a Supreme Court ruling that reduced the duration, in this case, to 30 days. So I just think we have to ask the question: is what we want for New Hampshire? A mechanism that was originally used to disenfranchise African Americans and people moving in a very mobile society that we have today, which is even obviously more mobile and interconnected than ever before.
Yeah, I have to disagree with the representative. There's nothing in this bill that disenfranchises anybody with a 30-day minimum. It simply says there's two different ways that you can register to vote. One prior to 30 days prior to the election, and one 30 days up to the election. It doesn't stop anybody from voting. It just says if you're 45 or 50 days in advance of an election, you want to go down and vote, you have to supply certain pieces of paper. Or if you don't have any of those, say you don't, and sign this thing saying you live where you say you do, and you're a citizen and you're 18. It was a different set of requirements on how you fulfill that documentation of domicile. If it's within 30 days, you don't have to show it. You can go ahead and vote, and you can bring it in after the election. So there's no attempt here to go back to the post-Civil War era. I think I've heard that from a couple of people now, and I think that's kind of silly to tell you the truth. It's got nothing to do with
Oh, Madam Chair. My main point was just that they were originally proposed after the Civil War. It's a historical fact that that's the reason they were originally proposed. That's the main point I was making.
Representative Cody.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too will be voting against the amendment and the bill as amended, assuming the amendment passes. I have yet to figure out why it is necessary to do this. No one has told me. The Secretary of State has not given me an explanation as to why this is necessary. No proponent of this has given me a reason for any of this having happened. The state of New Hampshire got along very well prior to this and prior to the last several years without an adversarial voter registration process. I still am having great difficulty understanding why this is suddenly necessary. I once asked the Secretary of State, when did you begin to have hear about these concerns? And he said around 2005. And I was going to ask him why, but as I remember, we never got to an answer to that question. I think this bill, as amended, is unconstitutional. I think a court will eventually find it to be unconstitutional, and I will not vote for it. Thank you.
I want to suggest that Senator I think you missed the basics. You were saying that it's unconstitutional. it does not. The 30 days that we're talking about is just to say that you can come, you don't have to wait till the send the registration to sign an affidavit. You can sign an affidavit in those 30 days prior, which means it's easier for people who just moved in, they're finding their papers, maybe they can't find them yet. It's actually a courtesy, it's not more than needed.
Thank you. Further comments, Representative White?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm a little bit baffled by the constitutional amendment argument, and why an amendment to the New Hampshire Constitution in this particular instance would be particularly inexpedient. If people in New Hampshire, as some have said here, believe that this is an absolutely pressing issue on the state. Certainly, if the requisite percentage of them believe that, and this amendment were to go to ballot, the citizens of the state of New Hampshire could certainly amend the Constitution. We've amended this particular article of the Constitution just 30 years ago. That is not long when you consider this particular article was adopted in 1784. So I think to say that New Hampshire people having a say and weighing in on their Constitution and which is why we're legislating this, is because of a constitutional or a Supreme Court ruling around the particular issue of domicile. So to say that people are not willing to do that, if there's a problem or a perceived problem by a majority of the citizens here, this could certainly have been gone to a vote of the people of New Hampshire. And so I think that to suggest that that's inexpedient is simply in error. And the people have demonstrated in a number of times since 1784 the willingness to amend the Constitution to adopt or adapt to current times. And so I think that that's it's just simply ridiculous.
Representative Negron.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I find it interesting that all of us sit here in the election law committee because we ran a good campaign, people voted for us, and fortunately, we came out on top. It's really good for us to say that the voting process works, because this is where we sit. What about the case in 1974, a U.S. Senate race, where it was decided by 2 votes? I myself was a matter of a recount. But that's not the point of this bill. And the point of this bill is not about voter suppression. And the point of this bill is about disenfranchising people or college fees. If I took each one of you and asked you face to face, do you believe that only the right qualified voter in the state of New Hampshire should vote? I guarantee that all of you would say absolutely. And I would agree with you. Absolutely, only those qualified people should vote. We all believe that, or we wouldn't be here. But we have to ask ourselves, is it possible that there are some things that happen that aren't according to Hoyle or according to the law? You know what? We change RSAs all the time. Not because we think they're bad, it's because we want to make them better. And a lot of times when we find ourselves in a chasm, and we pigeonhole ourselves and we set up encampments, we do ourselves a disservice. I said this once before in a hearing. There's folks in here along with me that took an oath of office when we entered the military. And that was to defend the Constitution of the United States. And you know what? There isn't anything that says that after I retire that I stop defending the Constitution. And so I do it in a different manner, but as a public servant. We know that there are close races. And for us to be able to at least provide the people, like ourselves, who want to run the best possible outcome, the most fair outcome, then I think this gives us a better opportunity. Is it perfect? No. Is anything ever? No. But I believe what this does is it gives the state of New Hampshire the ability to go to bed at night, like all of us, that the votes that were cast were the right ones, and that the people that were elected were the ones that were the voice of the people. Thank you, ma'am.
further representatives to speak on this issue. Representative Lewis.
Madam Chairman, I've heard bandied about 30 days. I'm looking at the amendment, page 1, line 21. The person who has been president or residing in one town or rural New Hampshire for 30 or fewer days is presumed to be present for temporary purposes. The person who has New Hampshire for temporary purposes domicile. The sentence here, of course, is that if the person is able to identify age, place where he or she resides, and is able to prove that he or she acted upon the intent to stay, then that person is registered to vote. That creates an additional condition for anybody who has recently arrived in the state. So there is a 30-day waiting period. If you're not going to be able to show within the 30-day period that that you've done something that proves that you are a domiciliary. Another thing that bothers me as a lawyer, the word domicile and resident is floating around all over this bill. I'm not complaining about the bill and that, but this is the same way as the entire voting book. Anybody, I doubt anybody would ever want to read this whole book. I certainly would. But domicile and residence mean different things in different places. This bill doesn't do anything to clear that up. It simply places the burden on the voter to prove that it's either a domicile or a residence, and that the domicile is sufficient for voting purposes. And what the bill does, and I will reiterate what Mr. White said, the bill repeals the domicile affidavit for a long time. If you didn't have electric bill or something, you could create a domicile affidavit in which you do all kinds of things, including signing up for the penalties for knowingly and purposely providing false information and all of that stuff voluntarily in exchange for having the right to vote. Nothing wrong with that. You have to prove to a functionary that you have one of the documents listed or something similar. Now you're putting in the hands of an election official the responsibility for determining what is essentially the same thing. I remember at the last meeting having a discussion with First Lieutenant Elway about this business of having to register your kid at a public school as opposed to a private school. And something about the public having some skin in the game or something. My Representative Elway didn't think that gave me the right to vote. I would assume that there are probably one or two election officials around the state who might come to the same conclusion. And what that could wind up doing is creating a lawsuit, although I can't imagine that a lawsuit is something that small. But I don't think it's right. The reason it isn't right is that, as I've said in the last week, the right to vote is the single most important and sacred right of any citizen of the United States. And to make a citizen go through the hoops that Senate Bill 3 makes them go through just isn't fair. Thank you.
Further discussion on the amendment, Representative White.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just want to go back to the constitutional thing. And I think that the one thing that we might all appreciate, even though some of the English is perhaps a little bit old, is the Constitution is fairly succinct in what it means. And it was drafted that way very particularly. The New Hampshire Constitution defines Part 1, Article 11, in 279 words, what it means to be eligible to vote in the state of New Hampshire. Contrast that with the amendment that's being discussed right now at over 8,000 words for the stated purpose around this table of defining domicile. 279 words, 8,000 plus words. And I think we have to be mindful that New Hampshire voters could clearly, and we could clearly draft an amendment for that 279 words that made it clear if the majority of people in New Hampshire think there's a problem with the definition.
Further discussion on the amendment. The amendment contained to Senate Bill 3-2017-1775. I'm going to call for the vote after I make a rather non-germane comment from Representative White's use of technology in regards to counting words at 279 to 8,000. I would simply point out that, well, maybe not all committee members are in favor of this bill. The committee has at least 3 lawyers on it, and we can make any word turn into 10 or 20.
Fair enough. Good for you.
Madam Chair, I think you're underestimating lawyers by quite a bit.
All right, thank you. All right, I'm going to ask the clerk to call the roll, please, for the amendment to Senate Bill 3. The amendment is 2017-1775. Amendment 1775.
Representative Davis? Yes. Representative Tusa? Yes. Representative
Yes.
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 Representative Freeman?
Yes.
Yes.
No.
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 The matter on the floor, if it's so moved, would be SB3 amended 1775. Is there a motion on that? Pardon? 11-9,
It's a
sorry.
nonpartisan bill.
Representative Hill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'd like to move Senate Bill 3.
As amended 1775. Thank you. Is there a second? Is there any discussion on this motion? Representative Pearson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've sat on this committee so far 3 years now. I've seen bills like this, and the comment I'm going to make certainly includes SB3. I've yet to see, and because of voting is such a fundamental right, when courts look at this is a matter of strict scrutiny. I have yet to see a compelling state interest for bills like SB3 and indeed Senate Bill 3. Because there's no compelling state interest with this bill, I will be voting against the OTTA.
Any further discussion? I'd just like to say that I've heard a lot of discussion about this bill, and there was some comments made about the length of my description last week on this bill. And as this committee has pointed out, this is just dealing with domicile, because as it stands today in the law, you can establish domicile by simply being present in the state and signing an affidavit without any objective way of measuring your intent as to meet the qualifications for domicile, which are residency and intent. And SB3 simply takes away that process and provides for an objective verification of that intent. It doesn't take away any voting group. It's not creating classes of people. It's simply putting, I would submit, every registrant on the same footing in regards to the requirements. And I agree with Representative Hewitt that the right to vote is a constitutional right. And it is an important right to protect, but it's always interesting in talking about constitutional rights as to whether or not you think they should come without burden or with burden. And your position on that often changes depending on what constitutional right you are talking about. And I think that this committee has this year most recently seen that in regards to the constitutional rights, in regards to the right to bear arms, where there is a faction that says it should be done without limit, and a faction that says there need to be reasonable restraints put on that constitutional right. We have a similar debate here, and while we can argue the value of each of those, I think that when it's really important to have this kind of debate, and I think it's a good debate. Representative Cody.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Curious that you mentioned that rights need to come with burdens. I think that's exactly the point. I think that Senate Bill 3 puts an impermissible and unconstitutional burden on the exercise of the right to vote. Thank you.
Representative Pearson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With regards to your comments on domicile and its subjective nature and how we're not making a class of citizens here, I respectfully disagree. Well, I agree that one, that domicile is subjective, and by trying to require that a group of people objectively prove a subjective intent, you're going to inherently create a class of citizens between those who can objectively prove their subjective intent and those who have no objective proof of, let's face it, a subjective intent. And that classification is disenfranchisement.
Thank you, Representative Harrington.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I disagree with you slightly on the terminology. I wouldn't use the word that some rights come with burdens, more that rights come with responsibilities. And I think people have a responsibility in this case to, there's no way you can look at someone and say, that person lives in this town, they're a U.S. citizen, and they're over 21. You have some way of showing that you qualify to vote, and that's your responsibility. It's the same way when you mentioned firearms. If I walked into Riley's down here and I said, I'm 21, I'm a U.S. citizen, I've never been convicted of a crime, therefore I want to buy that gun, here's $500, they'd say, where's your ID, where's your background check? So there's responsibility for me to show that to them. My responsibility in that case would also be not to be convicted of a crime. So it's not like we're saying that this is the only constitutional right that we say that there's responsibilities on the individual for. And I just think that's what we're doing here. We're just saying you're responsible to show that you're eligible to vote. That's all. And the ultimate out is if for some reason you don't have any paperwork, you don't have anything that verifies who you are, where you live, or whether you're a U.S. citizen, you can sign something that says you don't have any of that, and you know what, you still get to vote.
Thank you, Representative Exum.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to be opposing this bill. I think you all know why I'm going to be opposing this bill. I'm not going to get into that, both what is in the bill, but it's more the premise behind the bill and the process that is going to create it. I agree with something that Representative Freeman said earlier, that we all know that this is about issues larger than just what's in this bill. This has become a partisan fight, Democrats versus Republicans, and it's politics. Politicians are going to politicize things. I get that. But I think at the end of the day, we all want to go back to our voters and say that we're able to reach across the aisle and work with the other party, whether we're in the minority or the majority, and reach a compromise that will get something done. We've been hearing about perceptions of problems in our voter system for the last 6 months. And right now, we have a bipartisan way to address those perceptions that I think everybody in the House, or just about everybody in the House, and I think everybody on this committee could get behind, which is putting money into the Attorney General's office to fund the investigation of our voting system. And I could see myself voting for this bill if we have a process where the Attorney General looks at our voting system. If we have proof that there are holes in our problem, if there's proof that we need to tighten up our voting systems, then come back to me in 2 years and let's talk about this bill. But until we have proof, I think it is deeply irresponsible of us as legislators to legislate based just on perceptions. And one of my constituents was asking me what to expect today, and I said that it was going to be a show. And I said it was more than a show. I don't want to say what kind of show I said it was going to be because I don't want to be called up in front of legislative administration next week. And we all know what kind of show this is.
First, I gavel you out of order.
We're down in the partisan mud, and we're throwing it at each other, and we're getting it all over ourselves. And instead of this, we have an opportunity to reach a compromise and really protect the integrity of our voting system, and I really hope that we do it. We'll do it.
Any further comments or discussions on the motion on the floor, which is OTP-A, Senate Bill 3? Seeing none, I'm going to ask the clerk to call roll. Hey, I don't until it's done after this year, so.
About to pass this now. Representative Dean Bailey.
Yes.
Representative Sousa. Representative West.
Yes.
Representative Hughes. No. Representative. Sorry.
Yes.
Representative Jim Check. Representative Freeman. Representative Representative Maker.
Yes.
Representative Feldman Silver.
Yes.
Representative Wall. Representative Cody.
No.
Representative Ward. Representative Moynihan.
No.
Representative Dana.
No.
Representative Pearson.
No.
Representative Healy.
No.
Representative Wright.
No.
Representative Porter. Representative Kirkson.
No.
Madam Chair.
Yes. SB3 has passed as amended. All right, committee, please come to order. So, we have to be scheduled for next, Representative Lewis. Oh, all right, thank
No,
you.
I was
I
actually going to talk
apologize.
about you. I was going to tell you that Representative Hu will be preparing the minority report.
Thank you.